This is a reading from Characters of the Reformation by Hilaire Belloc. Chapter 15. James I of England. James I of England struck at the beginning of the 17th century the note which was henceforward to affect all modern life so profoundly. That note was the independence of nations, as lay societies, from the moral judgment of the Church. Henry IV of France, his contemporary, was the symbol, as we saw in the last chapter, of the fact that the Reformation would not be successful in its attempt to overwhelm our civilization. In France, after a furious struggle in which the leaders of the nation had half of them gone Protestant and engaged in fierce civil wars against the other half, the nation as a whole had come down on the right side of the hedge, mainly through the energy of the city of Paris. But in France, also the new nationalist spirit was rising, and we shall see later what a height it reached under Louis XIV, Henry IV's grandson, before the end of the century. James I of England stands for that nationalist principle which, in the succeeding 300 years, completely conquered. Today, everyone, for the moment, accepts the principle that the nation is sovereign and lay, completely independent of every international control. The modern nation gives no obedience to any defined international moral authority. Let's remember when this book was written, because things have changed since then. Now we have globalism trying to gain traction. Such as had been the Catholic Church with the papacy for its supreme judge during all the centuries when our European civilization was being built up. The modern nation is not completely independent, but admits no religious definition. Any citizen who prefers his allegiance to a religious body to his allegiance to the nation is regarded as a traitor. Religions of all kinds are regarded as the private affair of individuals. When the citizens differ among themselves upon religion, it is the duty of the state to keep the peace between them, but not to affirm itself the guardian of any one set of doctrines. The sacred thing to which everybody must adhere, the one doctrine against which no one may protest on pain of heresy, is the doctrine of patriotism and the right of the nation to its complete independence. There is thus no common law binding all nations. Such, undoubtedly, is the present situation of the white world, Europe, and the extension of Europe on the American continent, and in the various European colonies and dominions. How long this absolute nationalism will endure, no one can say. One can only be certain that it will not last indefinitely. Of its nature, it creates a state of affairs in which no nation, if it is strong enough to commit the crime, can be restrained from murdering another nation. There is no international police. Therefore, we have a state of affairs which is that of moral anarchy, mutually destructive, and, if it be pressed to its full conclusion, the absolute certain end of our civilization. Nationalism, then, is for the moment enthroned, and James I, at the beginning of the 17th century, when the great boiling mass of the religious quarrel was beginning to crystallize into nations Protestant and Catholic, inaugurated the full practice of nationalism. Here it may be objected that the launching of this new doctrine, the first name of which was the divine right of kings, and the attempt to practice it was much older. For we must always remember that whether it is called the divine right of kings or the full independence of the nation, it comes, as we shall see in a moment, to exactly the same thing, expressing the same idea and having the same consequence. The first official and public statement of this sort was made by Cranmer, the first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury, at the coronation of little Edward VI as early as 1547, 56 years before James I came to the English throne. The doctrine had been formally enunciated in a loud voice from the altar steps of Westminster Abbey, in the sermon which Cranmer addressed to the little boy king on his enthronement. Cranmer reminded him that no power on earth could claim any rights over the King of England, and he said this, of course, as a direct challenge to the papacy. Hitherto it had been admitted throughout Christendom that quarrels between Christian nations were subject to the general moral authority of the Church, and to ultimate appeal to the papacy in cases of specific dispute. In other words, Christendom had been regarded as one realm, of which the particular nations were only provinces, and a certain moral law and a certain visible organization were accepted as having common authority throughout. All the time, between Cranmer's declaration and the accession of James I, 1603, the matter had remained in dispute. To one group of men throughout Europe, and much the larger group, the new doctrine appeared monstrous and revolutionary. By another, serious, though much smaller group, it was clung to desperately and advanced upon every possible occasion. We all know how furiously the battle raged in England itself, and how, as late as 24 years after Cranmer's declaration, the Pope still claimed to release the de facto subjects of Queen Elizabeth from their allegiance de jure when he excommunicated that monarch. The point about James I is not that he began the thing, but that he inaugurated its full and undisputed practice. At the end of that generation, not quite 50 years later, it was accepted everywhere that the religion of a state must follow the religion of its government. At this point, it is important to understand how this phrase, which sounds to us so quaint, the divine right of kings, is really identical with our most modern nationalist doctrine in the time of James I. Rather than 300 years ago, men talked of the thing in terms of the rights of princes, that is, monarchs, rather than in terms of the rights of nations. But it applied even then just as much to states in which there was no prince. It applied to an independent democratic republic like Geneva, or an aristocratic republic like Bern or Holland, or to any other of the free cities of Germany, whether these were governed by a few rich men or by public opinion. The operative word in the sentence is not king, but divine. And when people talked of divine right, they meant the right to govern with private responsibility to God alone, and not to any general organization of Christendom here on earth. James I himself made this perfectly clear in the speech which immediately followed his coronation. He claimed the right to call himself Catholic. The Church of England, of which he was now the head, uses that term in her formulae, and recites it, of course, in the fundamental creed, generally called that of Nicaea. James underlined this point with all his might, intending by this emphasis to reconcile with his complete sovereignty, if it were possible, that half of his English subjects, that minority of his Scottish subjects, and that overwhelming majority of his Irish subjects who were fully Catholic in tradition, practicing when they could, or when they could not, demanding the Mass and the full functioning of the old religion. James did not at first desire to persecute that religion, as William Cecil had done in the name of Elizabeth. What he did want was to get everyone to take the oath of allegiance, which declared him to be the completely independent head of everything within his realm, clerical and lay. Therefore did he denounce with the utmost violence the claims of the papacy, and directed all his policy against them. He called the Pope the three-headed beast, so that there should be no doubt about his attitude. He reiterated the claim that the crown of Great Britain was imperial, that is, subject to no other lay state, and he concluded that it was not subject to any external moral authority either. It is interesting to note that James was, at one moment of his reign, in active negotiation with Rome, or rather with the agents of Rome, to see whether some formula could not be drawn up which would get over the difficulty of the oath of allegiance. If some set of words could be found which would satisfy the abstract papal claim to depose a monarch by relieving his subjects of their oath of allegiance, some form of words making quite clear the acceptation by all subjects, clerical and lay, of the full sovereignty of the monarchy and its freedom from any kind of superior international power. He would not have been content. No such formula was found, but it is significant that he should have made such efforts to discover one after his violently open break with Rome. Most people think of James I as a man steeped in Calvinism, because he had been brought up under the rules of the Scottish Church. This is a great error. He had indeed been brought up in the main under the rules of the Scottish Kirk, but during the earlier years of life, when character is formed, there was a struggle as to whether the religious organization or its opponents should get hold of him. His own mother, Mary Queen of Scots, had died because she was strongly Catholic and because she represented the Catholic cause, and James himself always had a personal leaning, if not to the Catholic spirit, at least to Catholic individuals. His opposition to the Church was political rather than doctrinal. He prided himself on his learning, especially in theology, and it is only fair to admit that he did not pride himself without some cause. He was a very widely read man, and one of high culture, though of displeasing and probably vicious character. He regarded pretty well any tenet as debatable, save that one tenet which roused him to wrath, the supremacy of the Pope in moral matters, even over sovereign princes. It is impossible to say what would have happened in the way of Catholic toleration under James I, but for the action of that man of genius, Robert Cecil. He was the second of the Cecils who governed England. His father, William Cecil, had taken over the management of the country in 1559, trained his son Robert to statecraft, and was succeeded by that son without a break, although efforts were made in the transition of power from father to son to disrupt the succession by the introduction of new favorites. It was Robert Cecil, controlling the government at the end of Elizabeth's reign, who had brought James to the throne, for the succession of Elizabeth was disputed, and the Queen herself had named nobody. James came into England from Scotland with little knowledge of English ways. He talked with so strong a Scottish accent that it was not easy to understand him, and he brought with him a group of Scottish companions highly unpopular in England. It must be remembered that Scotland had been the hereditary enemy of England for centuries, and was still regarded as an alien nation. James depended more and more upon his statesman, Robert Cecil, who not only had the very highest talents as a statesman, but was privy to all the secrets of the governing class around the king. He held firmly in hand a universal spy system, and was adept, as his father had been, not only at discovering plots against the crown, but at creating them by the use of secret agents, and at nursing and fomenting them when they had started. Now it was Robert Cecil's prime object to prevent a Catholic reaction. The whole policy of his family and tradition was the gradual imposition, by force and trickery, of the new religion upon the English people. They had so far succeeded that, when James thus came to the throne in 1603, quite half the English were opposed to their ancient faith. Most of that half were no doubt indifferent to religion, as were many on the other side also, but in 1603, quite half England was, upon the whole, anti-Catholic, and it was Robert Cecil's business to make all England anti-Catholic in time, or at any rate, if that should be impossible, to make so large a proportion of England anti-Catholic as to render the full return of the faith out of the question. Whether he invented the gunpowder plot or not will always be disputed. There is no positive proof that he did. All that we know for certain is that he knew all about it just after it was started, and nursed it carefully. Gunpowder was then a government monopoly, and yet the conspirators brought it openly across the Thames in large quantities, and all their movements were known. Cecil exposed the plot just at the right moment to produce the most effect, and it is from that date, 1606, that the tide turns and that England tends to become more and more a Protestant country. Cecil himself died rather early in James's reign, only half a dozen years after the great sensation of the gunpowder plot and the execution of the victims. But by that time his work was done. Catholics were hopelessly divided in England and no longer the bulk of the nation. Meanwhile, James, for the nearly 12 years in which he still had to live, hankered after toleration. What he wanted was not only a quiet realm, but a peacefully united one. He married his daughter to the very foolish Calvinist German elector Palatine, who tried to usurp the kingdom of Bohemia and fell into disaster thereby. But he did everything to marry his only surviving son Charles to one of the great Catholic reigning families. He failed to make the match with Spain, but succeeded in arranging one with the royal house of France. In the marriage treaty, it was stipulated that Catholics in England should be free to practice their religion. He did what he could to prevent the butchery of priests, and altogether he was the originator of that Stuart policy of attempting religious truce, which is one of the chief accusations against that dynasty raised against them by later official historians. He and his son after him, and both his grandsons, Charles II and James II, all worked for toleration, not because they regarded religious tolerance as a good thing in itself, but because they thought it good policy for the realm. However, above everything else in the eyes of James I, the complete independence of the English crown must be preserved, and it could only be preserved by supporting and continuing the Protestant policy of his predecessors. He stood for divine right. He watered and nourished that plant until it took firm root, and since his day has spread its doctrines everywhere, so that today, under another name, it is quite undisputed, with the consequence which we see around us.